back in Galesburg.
We are broadcasting. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to our webinar today. I am Jennifer Hernandez, Assistant Professor in Teaching and Learning at the School of Education, Health and Human Behavior at IUPUI, and a part of the Dream Collective. At the Dream Collective, we're working really hard on dismantling racism through education, advocacy, and mobilization. And this is one of our many webinars that we have done and are planning to do in the future. And today we are lucky and honored to have Dr. Jim Scheurich with us. He is a professor of urban education studies in the doctoral program at Indiana University. And he has been working with urban education and critical whiteness for many, many years. And so as a scholar activist, he's here with us today to share his knowledge about anti-racism work and critical whiteness from an educational and scholar activist perspective. So thank you very much, Jim, for giving us your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Yes. Just as a reminder to all the participants that are coming in, we would like to make sure to really best organize this conversation. We are going to be dividing the questions into two categories before transitioning to the Q&A section for our discussion. So if you have any questions that you would like Dr. Scheurich to answer, please put them in the Q&A, and we have some tech support with us that will help get those to me, and I will ask them for you. But we're going to start off right now by asking Jim, just kind of in general, can you tell us a little bit about your professional career and how you have engaged in anti-racist work over the course of your life?
So I've been a professor for 28 years. I started at UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin for 12 years, and then I went to Texas A&M University as department chair for 8. And then the rest of the time I've been here at Indiana University, Indianapolis. But before I became a professor, since my undergraduate days, I've been a community activist around issues of race, class, gender, sexuality. So I've been involved in community organizing. I've organized and participated in demonstrations. I use all aspects of my work as a professor, whether research, research or service or teaching. All of it involves anti-racist issues. I've helped organize grassroots organizations. Like we have one now that's a multiracial organization in Indianapolis. It's been going for about 3 years, and I participate with other grassroots organizations. So before I got into advanced degrees, I was active, and since then I've remained active.
Wow, that's amazing. Have you always been active in the community organizing in the Indianapolis, Indiana area, or have you been organizing nationwide?
Since I came to Indianapolis, within 1 year of arriving, I started working on community organizing, working with existing grassroots organizations, and then in fact, Nate Williams, who's one of your colleagues at your university, drew me into a major project on neoliberalism in education that I've been involved in ever since. So within my first year, I went to a public meeting that Nate was a presenter at, and that was kind of the start of it all. That was in my first year, I think 9 years ago.
Wow. Well, we are definitely happy to have Dr. Williams with us, and we're hoping he brings some of that neoliberalism and activism to us here at Edwardsville at SIUE. So I know, Dr. Scheurich, that you have decades of experience in training and preparing school leaders across the nation in your urban education studies program. Would you speak to what you envision for white folks who are in K-12 education as it relates to breaking the toxicity of white supremacy in our classrooms and schools?
Okay, so for white educators, I think the first step is to do some work on yourself. And I'm going to go through a few points on that. So one of the ones that white folks need to understand is that folks of color live in a very different world than white folks do. As white folks, we don't worry about the police doing something to us. We feel safe, we feel comfortable, and particularly those of us who are educators have decent salaries, we have health care, we don't live on the edge of one check away from disaster. I grew up that way, but since I got an education and was a school teacher at one point and then a professor, it's been we white people need to understand we live in a very different kind of world. We can't just look at what's happening to folks of color and say, well, why not this or why not that? Because we don't understand the world that they live in. For example, all parents of color, particularly Black parents, are pretty much on a daily basis afraid of what may happen to their children anytime their children leave the house. So if you're a parent, you can imagine that every time your child leaves the house, they may be in life danger, so that makes things very different. But also then when even if you're in your own home, you're not safe. We've seen the break into the home and all the shooting and 2 people dead. We've seen the killings by police. Black people live in a world that's dangerous, and they even run into microaggressions or actions like bird watching or walking through a grocery store or taking a nap in the general dorm room, even though you have a room in that dorm, or organizing a party in a park that's in your neighborhood, or running through a neighborhood because you like to jog or run, it's just constant. And when it's not happening in that instant, you don't know that it's not going to happen in the next instant. You don't know if when some clerk treats you badly, or if you're trying to enroll in the university and you're not seeming to get help in doing it, is that happening because of your race, or is that just happening because this person doesn't know how? You're always in that position. So one of the first things is to realize that folks of color live in a different world. Another part of that white people need to understand is we are the beneficiaries of a system that has privileged us and continues to privilege us. So I'll give you a good example. After World War II, the federal government put out these housing loans. And housing is where most working class and middle class whites have most of their wealth. That's where their wealth is. And those loans were only available to white people. They were specifically excluded from Black folks. So one of the results of that is that more money, if it'd been for everybody equally, there would have been less money per person. Besides the fact that Black people were totally excluded, but their exclusion increased the amount that white people got. So here's this millions and millions of dollars that was transferred to white people and excluded from Black people, say. And so that drove a huge difference, a wealth gap difference. But that's not the only policy. we've had state, local, national policies since the beginning of this country that favored white people and disfavored people of color. I'll give you another example from, it's understanding how the system operates all the time so that we white people live a privileged life, that we're being taken care of and added to, often at the expense of folks of color. So it's being subtracted from folks of color and added to us. I have more because folks of color have less, and that's been a systemic policy operation in this country. For example, here in Indianapolis, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, 10 years ago, there's this area of well-to-do whites in the north side, kind of a little bit on the west, north side, and they didn't like the sewage smell. So they convinced the city government to spend millions piping their sewage down in the midst of a black community that Dr. Williams lived in at the time as a young boy. So their housing values went up because the sewage smell went away. Black people's housing went down because the sewage smell arrived, thanks to the power that this well-to-do white group had to move the sewage out of theirs and send it down. It's like a metaphor, to move from, to enhance white people and to disfavor people of color. And if this is just happening year after year after year, decade after decade, 100 years after 100 years, you're starting to get these system-wide inequities. I'll give you another example. So our school board, the Indianapolis Public School Board, they had a contract with a union for bus drivers and monitors. They worked with the Chamber of Commerce, who were supposed to be helping them to make things more efficient. They worked with the Chamber of Commerce to take that contract away from the union, which was, the bus drivers and monitors are like 75, 85% black. And those people were making a decent wage, had health care, a living wage. So they moved that contract to a private company and then claimed that they saved $71 million by doing that. So let's think of where that $71 million came from. So to get to that lower contract number and save the $71 million, that company is going to have to reduce the wages and benefits for bus drivers and monitors. Now, the current ones can apply, but they're going to be applying for a job that pays less and has less benefits to the tune of $71 million. So let's say 80% of them were black. So about $50 million got subtracted directly out of the black community. And the main goal of the chamber and all that process was to reduce school taxes on them. The chamber is overwhelmingly, particularly in terms of its large, big dollar members, that's overwhelmingly white people. So they basically, instead of allowing this contract to continue paying these black bus drivers and monitors a decent wage and benefits, they subtracted that to protect their own wealth. Am I being clear?
Yes.
So unfortunately, the university here did the same thing. They outsourced their food service workers to a company and lowered their costs. So that meant there's more money for our faculty at Indiana University, Indianapolis is hugely white. So that benefited us. I benefited from them subtracting those funds basically from the black community. So
can you tell us how you came to be aware of how you were benefited or privileged over time in your own lived experience?
Well, I read incessantly, and there's incredible work on the racism in this country, and from Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, you know, Manning Marable's How Capitalism Underfunded Black America, you know, Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, incredible book. Joe Fagan is a white man. He was been president of the American Sociological Association, which, you know, very prestigious position. He has a book out called Racist America that covers all of this wall to wall over the entire history of the US. There's a book called Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States that deeply covers the genocide. No matter how much you think you know about that, you don't nearly know as bad as it was. My students read that every year and they're just stunned by how horrible 85% of the native people were wiped out because these white Europeans wanted property and minerals and, you know, et cetera. They wanted the land. And another part is I work with and interact with faculty of color. We have here at our School of Education, we're 60% faculty of color, which doesn't exist anywhere.
Yeah,
no major university, school, or college of ed has 60% faculty of color. When I was department chair at A&M, we went from 25 to 45%. People told us that if you increase equity, quality will go down. That is not true. Our quality in all kinds of productivity, from money to articles, any measurement went way up. Even though we were the smallest department in the college there, and they didn't do it per capita, they did it overall. So we were the smallest, so it was hardest for us, but we went from 4th to 2nd in the productivity criteria, you know. So, and in our doctoral program is 60% students of color, overwhelmingly Black. Dr. Williams is a graduate from that program. So that doesn't exist anywhere in the country, you know. That's something our faculty have built over time, you know, in a very focused kind of way.
In all your years of experience in teaching in that program for urban educational studies, what advice or what would you say classroom teachers can do to challenge their districts and building leaders to act, as opposed to just putting out a statement of equity and diversity? What are some actual steps they can take?
Well, I want to go back to what I was saying before is you have to do some work on yourself. You have to understand these kind of things that I'm talking about. You know, you can read, there's all kinds of online sessions now on these, like Kimberly Crenshaw is weekly doing these sessions. Kimberly Crenshaw is this incredible scholar, and she's not the only one. What you all are doing, these kinds of things are going, so you need to educate, and we white people need to understand, you know, that we are being privileged. You know, what we have is being subtracted, has been subtracted over time from folks of color, and we need to take that seriously. And we need to understand that, I always say, I'm a racist. How can I not be? I am white in our system. The system is racist, so every day I'm privileged, every day I'm comfortable. How can that not be impacting me? So white people say they're woke. I would never say I'm woke. The battle every day to try to be conscious of racism and anti-racism is pretty hard work, and it's so easy to get caught up in the comfort and safety and the privilege of being white. So I think that you really have to kind of look in the mirror and understand that you have to struggle with this constantly, and you never get out of it. You know, a person of color can't walk out the door and be outside racism. There is no outside racism door. Well, the same thing is true of white people. There's no door outside white racism. I live inside white racism. It lives inside me. So that's where you have to start, you know.
Mhm.
Another thing you can do is if you've got folks of color on your faculty at any level, pay attention to what they're saying, you know, value what they're saying. Don't be the first to speak, be the last to speak, you know, listen, learn from them. The other thing is white people, you know, have this, it's like, oh, you can't be too harsh. You can't be too confronting. This is, we have this emergency that's been going on for hundreds of years.
Mhm.
Kids of color come out of our schools largely believing they're not smart because that's what they've learned in school, you know? The ones that have a different view are actually the exceptions. So we saw the police killings, you know, all of this isn't new.
Mhm.
What we saw on TV, that 8 minutes and some second, that's not new. Every year those things are happening, you know. So we have to treat this as an emergency. We've got to have urgency behind it. And that means we got to quit being so nice. We've got to, to me, to be an anti-racist as a white person, you've got to be constantly risking your privilege. You know, you can't play it safe. If you're playing it safe, in my view, you're playing it complicit. You know,
Absolutely.
you're going to have to confront your white colleagues. You're going to have uncomfortable. That doesn't mean you don't care about them. You know, Bell Hooks talks about this. You can deeply care about people and confront them at the same time, you know, and hold them accountable and not let them off the hook. So it's not a matter, in fact, I would say confronting our fellow white people about their participation in whiteness is one of the most loving things you can do. What kind of world do we want to live in? We live in a world that's hugely inequitable, that hugely benefits whites at the cost of folks of color. If we don't want to live in that world anymore, then we have to speak up. We have to take risks. I always say, speak up, stand up, act up. You know, you got to get involved. You know,
Absolutely.
you
I know.
got to become that person that everybody knows is going to raise these issues.
Yes, I can relate. I've been that person a couple of times myself throughout my life. And I remember in my own doctoral program, my white doctoral advisor that I talked to you about earlier, Dr. Matthew Davis, used to call us recovering racists. All white people are just in the process of recovering once we realize that we've been socialized to a white supremacist society. And so to look at ourselves that way. Largely in our area here around the Edwardsville, Illinois area, most of our K through 12 teachers are really teaching to primarily white students. What wisdom or actionable steps would you suggest to the white classroom teacher who is teaching anti-racism curriculum to a majority white classroom?
Are you talking about they're teaching in K-12 or they're teaching in the university?
Well, I would say both, because some are, of course, in K-12 around this area, but in the university too, a lot of our population is majority white.
Well, I would say that it largely tracks what I was just talking about. The kind of work that a white person needs to do on themselves, they also need to do with other white people. Look, racism is a white problem. It's a problem for folks of color, but they didn't create it, and it isn't their problem. It's our problem. The problem in this country is white supremacy. You know, it's not people of color. People of color have incredible cultures. They've been incredibly resilient in the face of hundreds of years of. I don't understand how they've survived as well as they've survived, given the conditions we white people have placed them in. From slavery through Jim Crow through and they're very committed to this country regardless, you know. So white supremacy is the problem, and it's a white problem, you know? And so we're the ones that need to get on it. So in a classroom, you need to, with white students at any age, you need to start working with them on understanding white racism and how it works and how we can, you know, consciously or not, participate in it and how we benefit in it, you know? Some of the most, I think, obvious things are white people, even ones who call themselves liberal, they don't want their kids going to school with too many kids of color. Or they don't want to live in a neighborhood with, they move to white neighborhoods. They don't want to live in a neighborhood that's too many folks of color. And they certainly don't want their children marrying folks of color, you know? So to me, don't tell me you're a liberal when those things are true for you. If you've moved to a white neighborhood, you know you've moved to a white neighborhood. You knew what you were doing. If you've chosen to send your kids to white schools, you know what you're doing. And be honest with yourself, you know, what if your daughter or son wants to marry a person of color? How are you going to feel about that, you know? Let's be honest about all of this. Right. So I would follow the same thing. We need an honest curriculum in schools. Teachers need to understand that kids, the culture of kids operates differently. Like, sorry, like Black and Latinx children do not like individual grades. They do not like competing with their friends for grades. They like group grading. It's white upper middle class students who like individual grading. We have research that shows this, you know? So if we let white supremacy is white norms and white benefits for white people, you know, and when those norms are applied to other cultures, that's racism. So if I go to a school and I have to individually compete for grades and I'm a Black child, I'm experiencing racism, whether anybody says anything about it whatsoever, you know? So, but there is literature, there is scholarship on all of it. This is not hard to find. Cheryl Matias has a book called Feeling White that's about how these white teacher pre-service education, sorry, I'm not used to talking this much. We're not in the middle of a semester. Anyway, about how these young white women use emotions to deflect any understanding of their own racism. There's a ton out there. There's a online program called academia.com, and they'll send you, I want to receive scholarship on racism. And I get several a day of current scholarship on racism, you know, and it's everything from kindergarten all the way up to high theory stuff at the university. So it's out there if you want to learn. And if you're going to be a teacher, you need to learn, you know, and there is no area where this doesn't apply. You know, this is true for physics. It's true for biology. It's true for medicine. You know, white supremacy and racism is throughout our society. It's deeply embedded in law enforcement. We've been seeing that. It's deeply embedded in the prisons. It's deeply embedded on who gets the attention, you know, who runs the media. The New York Times came out with this two-page fold with these tiny little pictures of who led the big corporations, the big sports organization, the big entertainment organization, the government, all of this. And so there were hundreds of pictures, and they were overwhelmingly white men. There were some white women, and then there was a few folks of color, mainly because it was during the Obama administration, and they had appointed several people to top positions. So, I mean, you don't get something like that without a system that's biased. And then those who have wealth, they're always working to protect it. You know? Like Kendi points out and stamped from the beginning, from the beginning, even before we had a country, in Virginia, they were setting up laws that if poor white people collaborated with poor black people, they got punished worse than if they didn't. If powerful people have always pitted poor and working class whites against poor and working class folks of color. You know, if those groups would get together, we could run the country much more equitably than it's currently run.
Absolutely. How would you say white scholar activists could help and be in service to Black folks and not be a part of this problem of perpetuating white supremacy in at least their own spaces?
Don't think you're woke. You aren't. Another one is,
I hear you.
It's not a point of being an ally. They don't, ally, there's a kind of paternalistic part in that. It's not, they don't need your help. They need you to help yourself and your people because we are the problem, you know? Black people and Latinx people and the indigenous, they can get along fine, you know? They've survived us and we've done everything, you know, that we can think of and continue. And they're still surviving and they still believe in the damn country. It's amazing. So, then you got to put it in, you got to work on it everywhere. Every organization, national organization you belong to, I can remember raising these issues when I first became a professor. You know, I'd have half the room hating me for even where they thought race was not relevant to research when I started, you know. But at some point, a small group got together and said, we're going to change this organization. And we did. And now our major organization, University Council for Educational Administration, is the dominant narrative is social justice. Now, it's not as strong as I would like, but it's a lot more when social justice was thought to be irrelevant to research, you know? So in your organizations, in your department, raise the issues, make people uncomfortable, particularly address your fellow white people, you know, in your teaching, learn and teach, you know, in your writing, in your publication, write about it, you know, in your service. Like I'm on the university tenure and promotion committee, you know, and 2 years ago, I raised the issue of race in that process. And I thought the room was going to fall out, you know, that race, you know, what does race have to do with tenure and promotion? Well, it has everything to do with it, you know?
Absolutely.
And people would say, well, I didn't even know this person was a person of color. She just said she was from this third world country. You know, it's in her documents, and that's what she spoke. How can you not know this is a person of color, you know?
Right. Absolutely. And just, you know, again, I know we talked a little bit earlier, but when I started my PhD program in social justice work, your work on coloring epistemologies, for all you out there listening, you can find that on Google Scholar. Coloring epistemologies changed everything, changed the way I looked at academic research, brought me into the world of critical race theory, which really just shaped everything I do. So thank you again for that. I am curious, though, for your own experience, how do you spend time, because I struggle with this myself, how do you spend time in white spaces confronting white supremacy in your own positionality?
Well, people think I'm this fearless person. That is not true. I am, when I know I've got to speak to white people, especially to white authority, like my university, or the school board, I'm fearful. I'm not this courageous person. You know, I'm not. You don't have to be a courageous person. You just have to stand up, you know, and you don't have to be perfect. You get better as you do it, you know, but you just have to do it. For me, all of this is an ethical question. It's a question of what kind of world we want to live in. But ultimately for me, and I know for a lot, it's spiritual. Racism is a violation of the spirit. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to live in a world in which racism or sexism or heterosexism or classism are dominant views, you know? That is just wrong. It's spiritually wrong. And if you don't speak up, if you don't stand up, if you don't act up, you're complicit. You're complicit. You're supporting the system continuing. The only way the system quits continuing is for us white people to start standing up and saying, we don't want this anymore. And I'll tell you, ultimately, it's going to come down to reparations. This can't be performance. This can't be coming out with statements. That is not enough. We have to change how these structures work. You know, we have to change structures and make them truly equitable. We have to change how the money flows, how the treasure flows, you know, if we want equity. Equity cannot be a performance. Racial equity cannot be a superficial performance. If it's not causing us white people some pain and difficulty, we're not serious. If we're protecting our treasure, you know, if we're protecting our privilege, nothing's going to change.
Absolutely. And being in that position to stand up and speak up and say something and raise the issue often calls you out to or you are called out as a race traitor, right? Or somehow not in allegiance to that white supremacy. And for white people, that can be a very difficult and lonely place to be, for sure. So any wisdom or hints on how to face that when it's very lonely and you've been called out by your white colleagues and friends?
Power to race traitors.
I agree. Power, absolutely.
Well, you know, I mean, I take care of myself physically. You know, I eat well, I exercise. You got to take care of yourself on that level to sustain. You know, you can't ignore all of that, or you'll fall down and you won't get back up. You won't be with us in 2 years, in 5 years. This is a long-term struggle. We're standing on the shoulders of people who've died, white people, people of color. We're standing on their shoulders. We're building shoulders for those in the streets lately that are coming out. We did the work that made them possible. They're doing the work that will make the future possible. You know, so I also think, in my view, that, and this is just mine, I think a spiritual core is very important. You know, and I know a lot of people involved in the struggle, folks of color, white folks who are involved in the struggle, have a spirit. You've got to have a spiritual core, to me, to draw on for sustenance, you know.
Absolutely.
So, but you don't have to be brave, and you don't have to be good at it. You don't have to be experienced. You can be naive. You know, I have a student, you know, she was on a session and she said some things, and a white woman, you know, and she ran into trouble, but she learned out of that, and she's, you know, continuing to grow. Anybody doing race work, whether folks of color or white folks, you're going to be criticized. No matter, you'll be criticized from all directions. You know, I've been criticized by people of color. I've been criticized by white people. That's just part of the struggle. You know, nobody gets to escape critique. I don't want to escape critique. I learn from critique. In fact, that's the best thing to me, is be open to critique.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you're thinking about that in a university and other higher education institutional systems, how can faculty members hold their administrators accountable when those administrators refuse to even support the most basic needs of Black faculty and Black students?
Well, right now, the power structure is nervous about all of this. And we do have an opportunity space here, you know, so now's the time to push. So my experience, you got to always push, and the push, you may see only backlash against you from this year's push, and maybe it's 2 or 3 years later, you know, or maybe after you push and most people backlash against you, there'd be 2 or 3 people come up, build white allies to work with across the university. They don't have to be in your department or your college or school. They can be anywhere in the university. Build people to work together. You know, you can have, I always tell our doctoral students, you know, work together to get what you want. You have way more power than you think you do. And if you'll collaborate, you can change the program. You can change how the university works, but you got to be willing to stand up. You know, to me, we're kind of authoritarian country where people have been taught to not speak up, particularly in critical ways of authority. And I think that's a disaster for us. We have to speak up to authority. We have to get up in faculty meetings and say difficult things. Even if the chancellor's sitting there, we have to say difficult things. You know, even if we feel afraid. I do. I feel afraid. I feel irrational fear. You know, they're not going to do anything to me. I'm a full professor, but I still feel fear. You know, I was raised in this country and I feel fear of authority. What are they going to do to me? How are they going to hurt me? And they do stuff, you know, but also other people will reach out and support you. When I was an assistant professor at University of Texas at Austin, I was speaking out and the dean came to very strongly dislike me, and he was into revenge. And so he did things to limit me. But there were also people who valued what I was doing and they supported me, you know. People will reach out that you don't even know and support you, you know, and help you.
Could you give an example of how something was taking place with your dean and you were able to stand up and speak out and kind of make that statement that needed to be made in case people are unclear of what you're referring to?
Well, this thing about outsourcing our food service workers.
Right.
I mean, I'm on our university faculty council, so I specifically sought that position to speak out, you know. And so we have this period in our faculty meetings where you can raise a new issue. So I raised this issue and upset a bunch of people in the administration, you know, and they've done some things that I think were meant to harm me, you know, or limit me, constrain me, or best of all, try to drive me to leave and go somewhere else, right? But I had people that were supportive of me, you know, other faculty, administrators, maybe not at the top, but it's still administrators that were supportive.
Do you know of any resources that will demonstrate to administrators how recognizing the systemic racism of the institution could actually benefit the lives of the employees at the college, the students, and the college or university overall?
There are several organizations doing good work in this area. I can't remember their exact name, but there's one out of New Orleans that's very good. Okay. And, you know, they'll do 2 or 3 day, all up to like 10-day work with a group. There's one out of Chicago. If you just Google a little bit, you'll run into these both of those. We brought in the woman who did White Fragility. We brought her in. Our university brought in the one that did Joe Fagan, that did Racist America, you know. There's a lot of resources. They're easy to find. There's a lot of resources out there. Now, in terms of training white people, you know, doing experiences with white people that are rigorous and intense, I would say the New Orleans group and the Chicago group are the best that I've heard of. You know, but there are plenty of others, and they're in higher ed. They're actually, I'm not a higher ed scholar, but Dr. Patton Davis, who's at Ohio State,
Mm-hmm.
She knows, you know, a lot of folks, including herself, that does this work. Like she was here and she started a racial literacy program with the university where, like, Joe Fagan came in and spent 2 hours with our upper administration. And then he did a presentation for our faculty and staff. And then he did a presentation for students, you know, so the resources are out there, really strong resource. And like Dr. Lori Patton Davis, she knows a lot of people in the higher ed level that work with university faculty on racial issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I want to say one more thing.
Sure.
One of our faculty, Dr. Natasha Flowers, a Black woman, she's on our faculty. I got to know her really well, and she was willing to push me, you know. I mean, I came in as this well-known white scholar doing anti-racist work. That didn't mean anything to her. She pushed me and pushed me and pushed me and deepened my understanding far beyond anything I'd ever gotten from any books that I had read before, you know. There are likely scholars, faculty, activists of color, like I've met activists in Indianapolis, activists of color, you know, that can push you, you know. It's not their responsibility, you know, but if you happen to be in a situation where you have the opportunity to learn from folks of color, open your mind, you know, don't be defensive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was going to address too, both at SIUE, we are working on trying to educate faculty and staff around whiteness and issues of systemic racism, as well as many of our school districts in the area are starting to take on anti-racism training. So I was wondering if you had any wisdom or advice for what the leaders can do for the white faculty and teachers who are going to resist that type of training, and what are some examples of successes in that training, either building-wide, district-wide, or university-wide?
Well, we have here at our university, we have in the School of Ed, we have something called the Equity Center. And they actually do that kind of work with school districts and departments of education for about a 10-state area, you know. So they have, and they've been at it for several years now. The people running that are very perceptive about racism and anti-racism, and they've got some very rigorous kind of processes to help leaders and educators in K-12 schools address their own racism, racism among the faculty, and trying to bring that down to the student level. I used to do that kind of work when I was in Texas, but I haven't in a long time. But there are plenty of people doing that kind of work, and you could get a hold of our Equity Center and they could tell you where, you know, no matter where in the country you are, they could tell you people to go to that could help you with that kind of work.
Great, thank you. I wanted to remind all of our participants who are watching that if you have questions for Dr. Scheurich, you need to post those in the Q&A, and the chat is more for comments and getting links and access to information. If you haven't been following the chat, a lot of people have been putting up some resources that Dr. Scheurich has been addressing in his talk. So I want to move to some of the questions that we have from our participants.
Can I grab a drink of water first?
Absolutely.
It'll take me a couple minutes. Okay?
Yeah, you go right ahead and grab that drink of water. Not a problem. While you do that, I'll be talking with our participants a little bit. A lot of the resources and the books that Dr. Scheurich is sharing with you will be on the Dream Collective website. We will have a social justice reading list for anyone who's interested. I know that my colleague JT Snipes has put up his coloring epistemologies if you're interested. That's really a deep dive look that Dr. Scheurich did in looking at how the research coming out of the academy is inherently white supremacist and racist, ignoring the voices of people of color. So great job. We will also be, as part of the Dream Collective, beginning a podcast series to address issues of Black scholar activism in the academy, as well as critical whiteness issues as well. So I'm glad you got that water. You feeling better? Okay, good. Oh, there he is.
I'm not doing this because it's my book. It's actually Linda Tillman's book. I worked with Linda Tillman, who's an eminent Black scholar. This book covers all areas. You know, it covers LGBTQI issues, it covers Latinx issues, and it covers the research in those areas, and then it recommends what needs to happen. So this book is a really major resource that people can use.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That's definitely going in the library. It looks awesome. We do have some questions from the audience if you're ready to take those.
Sure.
Okay, great. So our first question is, a lot of discussion about racial equity and anti-racism for white folks centers on the teaching them the history and proving they have intentionally given skin privilege. This seems to presume that some white folks don't yet know enough or need to know more baseline historical knowledge before they can act on anti-racism. What anti-racist action steps can or should be taken by folks of European descent who already know enough about the history to recognize and have a distaste for white privilege? Great question.
So I would say, no matter what context you're in, family context, church or mosque or temple context, or job site, no matter what job site that is. I have a friend that works for the Chamber of Commerce, and she's raising these issues within that context. You know, no matter what context you're in, we need you to raise these issues in those contexts. You need to bring it up, regardless of it's going to make people uncomfortable, regardless of how fearful you might. Yes, is there some risk you might lose your job? Well, yes, probably less risk than you think, but yes, there might be some risk. But what we're talking about is incredibly serious. People are being hurt on a daily basis. Our schools are failing our Latinx and our Black students overwhelmingly. No matter what good intentions people might have, we are failing those students, you know? So, and this is operating in all aspects of our society, in housing, in wealth, in banking, in law enforcement, in media. It's operating everywhere, so we need to be acting on it everywhere. So whatever context you're in, around the dinner table, around a gathering of friends or family, yes, people are going to get upset. It's okay. It's okay if people get upset. It's okay if people get angry, you know? But if we're going to move this, we've got to be raising it everywhere, constantly.
Right. When you come face to face with white people who won't do the readings, don't want to take the time, you know, you've given us a lot of books. And I know that's not people in the academy, but just, you know, maybe even classroom teachers or people out in society who refuse to do the readings, who refuse to do that self-work. Are there any suggestions or resources that you may offer to that doesn't include the book?
Well, can we include YouTube videos?
Absolutely, I guess, yeah.
There's great YouTube videos by prominent, like Kindy's book, you know, he's got How to Be an Anti-Racist. Before that, he had Stamped from the Beginning. He's got some great YouTube videos on both of those books. George Yancey's a black philosopher. He's got some great videos. Bell Hooks has some great videos. There's all kinds of YouTube videos. If you don't want to read, you can watch and listen, or you can download them on, you know, Audible or something and listen to them rather than read them.
Right. That's great. Absolutely.
You know, there's organizations you can belong to that, like here in Indianapolis, there's pretty regularly white people organizing to self-educate and act together against racism.
Right.
Easily available, you know. I know this one woman, she's running constant white people education sessions that 6 or 7 people will show up to, and they sit around in a circle and talk about this because she's committed to doing that, you know. In most places that's available. We saw these Black Lives Matter organized in small towns, you know, and even if only 20 people came out, get with those 20 people and work together.
Right. And for our local participants who are listening, for white people dealing with white supremacy, it's called Standing Up for Racial Justice. And that is a white organization teaching other white people about white supremacy. And they do direct support, financial and physical, to Black Lives Matter St. Louis. Also, Expect Us St. Louis is our local Black Lives Matter chapter in St. Louis that's been running a lot of the protests. So very good resources. I have a question from somebody that I would like you to answer. The question is, I would like ideas for what white people in the non-professional sector, lower income, employee at will, can do to break down white supremacy without imperiling the roof over one's head. We don't need more homeless or unemployed people of any ethnicity. One thing I have done is to volunteer for political campaigns that I felt would push forward human rights and social justice. What are some other ideas that someone in a vulnerable economic and social situation can do to help promote social justice and civil rights?
Well, I think you're on the right track. Like, we have some white working class folks here in Indianapolis who are working on racial issues together. I would imagine if you live in a city of any size, there's probably the same thing going on there. So even if it's impossible to address in your work situation, you know, you may have kids depending on a salary that isn't all that great in the first place. So your activism may need to be in your church. There's a lot of churches, you know, we have several churches of color here that work on these issues. I do some work with groups that are supportive of undocumented immigrants, you know, that we've done demonstrations and done kind of guarding observations because ICE was harassing, you know, and so there's a lot of things that you can do that don't necessarily involve your work. Now, if you're at work and you have a union, contact your union officials. There's often things going on in unions around racial issues, particularly some unions are dominated by folks of color, and that's a very strong issue for them. We have those here. I've worked with some of the unions here. So if you can't work in your workplace, work at home, work at your church, work in your community, find other spaces to work in.
Great. Thank you. I had a great question from someone who wanted to know about your own wisdom from Black communities that has helped aid you in your own education, and how can we tap in, as white people, tap into the wisdom from Black communities without being a tourist or doing any kind of trauma porn type behaviors?
Well, again, I'll go back. There's a lot of reading by folks of color, both academics and non-academics, that address these issues. Also, there, like here in Indianapolis, there are multiracial organizations working on these issues. So then you're working side by side with folks of color on issues around race, you know, so you can learn in that situation, you know. There are churches that are multiracial, you know, that deal with racism. You can choose a church like that that's multiracial and dealing with racial issues. I think there's a lot of choices of that sort that you can make. You know, you can join organizations that have lots of folks of color in it. One of the major issues for white folks is they're rarely around folks of color in any real way, you know, and they think there's maybe 5 types of black people. Well, actually, there's millions of types of black people, you know. Like I belong to a gym that's multiracial, but has a very large black population that goes there. So I'm working out with men and women of color every time I go to the gym, you know, and we talk, and, you know, the ones that tend to go in the same time and work in the same area kind of get to know each other, you know, and sometimes, you know, we'll be sitting in the sauna and some issue will come up, you know, and we'll have a conversation. You can put yourself in spaces in which there are folks of color, you know, and you can listen and you can learn. You can have, like you said, we don't need to put any additional burden on folks of color, but there are folks of color in many situations where white people and folks of color are working together. Join a black church. I've never seen a black church reject a white person, but I've seen white churches reject black people. But, you know, join a black church.
Absolutely.
They will accept you. They will take you in. They will consider you one of their own.
Can you share with us your thoughts about white folks who move into black neighborhoods and then gentrify them, much like Brooklyn and some of the other places?
I mean, I live in a neighborhood that's overwhelmingly black. There's one other house on my block that has white folks. It's a rental. All the other houses are owner occupied. Most of them by older black couples who've lived in the house for a long time. Like the woman across the street from me, her grandmother raised her in that house, you know. I didn't come here to gentrify, you know, but the general neighborhood is gentrifying, you know. The only pathway I see is to work with local organizations that are trying to address and oppose those changes, because they're not, I mean, individuals can make choices, but gentrification isn't usually driven. There's usually, the city's usually involved, land, you know, owners, these people that buy up lots of property. They're constantly trying to buy my property. You know, they're constantly contacting me to buy, because they want to gentrify this. So there are major forces at work, not just individuals. So the only way I know is you have to work with organizations that are trying to address that issue. And I know that's going on. Like my daughter's a civil rights lawyer in Portland. I know that she's talked to me about the efforts in Portland to oppose gentrification. You know, so I know it's going on. I have a colleague friend in Harlem, you know, which is gentrifying. You know, so when you're working against gentrification, you're working against major, hugely funded operations, you know, landowners,
Absolutely.
chambers of
Absolutely.
commerce, you know,
Hmm. Yeah.
even organization like LISC, to me, help gentrify, you know.
Mhm.
They claim to be community driven, but all I see is top down control, you know, to
We've
get
seen
what,
a
you
Yeah,
know,
we've seen a lot of that here in St. Louis as well. In that area, there's an enormous amount of Black neighborhoods that have been gentrified. And so I thought that was a real poignant question. I got another really good question from a white female faculty member working on programs at her university. So I'm not sure which university she's talking about, to increase anti-racist hiring and retention practices. And her question for you is, how do you recommend balancing the need or desire of having people of color part of this conversation or movement as voices and decision makers in the process, with not adding yet another burden or expectation on people of color, especially those in academia, who are few and far between in my college? So, for example, inviting I'm sorry, it just moved. Inviting a colleague to a hiring committee when they have already served on 12 other ones, because they would be the token Black person on that committee.
well, your best solution is to get enough faculty, they aren't tokens anymore, you know. Like,
Right,
I
exactly.
remember when I was department head at Texas A&M, and I came into the office one morning and I had 4 Black faculty standing together talking, and I went, yes, that's success. You know, I'm not at, there's 1 or 2. I'm starting to get up numbers where it's normal, you know. So
Right.
hiring faculty of color is the fastest way you change a department or a school is who you hire,
Mhm.
and
Right.
what their values are, you know,
Right.
and not hiring people who are weak or non-existent on anti-racism, because
Right.
it's just too big of a issue for all of the university, any area of the university, you know.
Mhm.
So yeah, I understand. Another thing is to make changes in our tenure and promotion process that rewards that faculty of color often occupy professor positions differently than white. They often do differently than white faculty because of external forces and internal choices, you know? So how do we value the way they do a professorship as opposed to, say, a white person does a
Right.
professorship, you know?
Would
Uh,
you say that that tenure process in itself is inherently racist?
yes, yes,
Can you
because
expound on that?
it's white norm. There's a norm of how white professors who are not burdened by racism, you know, how that all looks for them. Whereas if you're a person of color, it's like when I started out, I said, folks of color live in a different world. And even in the university is not this fine anti-racist place. It's just as deeply embedded with racism as any other aspect of our society. You know, so uh, we have to look at our tenure and promotion process. Like last year, for the first time, the people that are on the university P&T committee, they got professional development on racism in our evaluation decisions. That
Mhm.
never happened before. You know, that came out of Lori Patton Davis's effort with racial literacy, people raising issues around it. Now that's just a start to me. I've said to them, okay, now we need to look at how faculty of color occupy the professorship differently than white faculty do. And we need to learn to value the way that faculty of color occupy the professorship. You know, this work is everywhere. It's in every aspect of the way our society works. It's in our Constitution, you know.
Mhm.
It's in our law, you know. It's in banking procedures. It's everywhere. Wherever we're at, we need to work on how the system is organized and favors white people over people of color. Not just favors them over, but disadvantages. Our advantage is a function of the subtraction from faculty of color.
So in that same kind of thinking, how would you describe how white people contribute to racial violence in these academic spaces, in particularly hiring processes or tenure committees? What is that critical whiteness piece that really accelerates that racialized violence in the academy?
So a white person should watch the George Floyd video all the way through. Watch the whole 8 minutes, 40 seconds of it. And understand that that is happening constantly in all kinds of ways. In fact, folks of color need our knee off of their necks in all of these contexts, in all of these situations, okay?
Yes.
So that, and there's a direct line from that to my privilege, to my comfort, to my safety. I'm not uninvolved, you know? That white policeman is protecting my privilege, my treasure, you know, my safety, my comfort, and have been doing that for hundreds of years. And I'm living in the product of that racism, that white supremacy, you know? So if you, and I'm gonna do this direct, if you are not speaking up, standing up, acting up, you are complicit. And even then, you'll still have some complicitness because you can't get rid of all of it. It's too large, but you can make a difference. You can, it's like in our school of education isn't perfect. All the racism isn't gone, but having 60% faculty of color, which we've built, has made a very different kind of space. Having 60% students of color in our doctoral program, we've built a very different kind of space, you know, for where something, and you can do that. You can build spaces in which something very different than the norm is happening.
In your experience, do you think that we can trust the white leaders who would be in the position of power in shaping that and doing that to do it?
Absolutely not.
So how can we
No.
make sure they're accountable?
If you're chancellor of Indiana University, you owe your job to commissioners at the state level who come from what I would call as conservative to right-wing Republican administration. If you don't keep them happy, you're out of their job. You're out of your job. You know. So no matter how liberal you are on your inside, maybe, and how much you want, good intentions are not that useful. You know.
Exactly.
So yes, I'm always highly suspicious of people in positions of power because you won't be there long if you raise too many hard issues. Now, there seem to be some people that are good at doing, there was a white woman who, University of Illinois, then she went maybe Syracuse. She was the best white administrator, and she was the head of University of Illinois. She was the best I ever saw at holding a strong anti-racist position and being able to exist in that, you know, in that context. Her, I would have worked for her anywhere, you know.
Right.
So there are a few people that are like that, and they'll be obvious when you see them, you know, when you interact with them, when you see what they're doing. But mostly you're going to be working against people in the power positions because they're protecting the status quo, and the status quo, no matter what its face looks like, is racist.
Right.
And that can easily be shown. I mean, if you come to the University of Indiana at Indianapolis and look at percent of full professors of color, it's teeny.
Right.
That's racism.
Mm-hmm.
That's historical systemic racism.
We had an incident happen here yesterday. We have as IUE, we have a listserv that a lot of faculty use to talk about issues at the university level and talk about different topics, and faculty members are typically the ones bringing up these topics. But the incident that took place yesterday became very racialized. It was done by a white person who put that up, and there were a few faculty of color that pushed back on those racialized violence. That's my opinion, and that was my interpretation of what was written in that listserv, as long as bullying and just really inappropriate hate speech and white supremacy. Again, that's my opinion of what I read. That happened yesterday, and I'm very proud of the fact that the chancellor shut down the listserv so that it could no longer promote that. If the chancellor was sitting in front of you right now, what would you suggest in your expertise and in your experience is the best place to go from here?
I'm not sure shutting it down is the best. I mean, it's there, you know. I mean, the sentiment, the views are there. What I want to know is, where's the white faculty? Were they, you know, you said faculty of color pushed back. Where were the white faculty pushing back? That's what I would have been. I would have, hey, you know, I would have been calling my white faculty friends. We got to push back here. You know, this is really our issue. You know,
I hate to tell you this, but I must admit that our white faculty was silent.
Well, you know, white people, no matter what level they are, seem so bought into this fragility thing, you know, that they're afraid, you know, that they can't handle it. Well, what if all of a sudden you're black? I guess you'd be gone because you couldn't handle it, right? Try being black in this country, you know. If we want to do something about that, stand in front of a mirror and say, I cannot let this go on and keep quiet. I am, you know, I can't claim that I'm afraid. I can't claim that I'm fragile. That's ridiculous. That's racism.
Right.
Anytime you talk yourself into not speaking up, standing up, acting up, that's racism. That's you directly participating in the continuance of racism. Let's quit kidding ourselves. There is no space outside this. You cannot go hide in your house, you know, and be free of all of this. It is just not true.
What would you, if you were chancellor of a university that had that happen in a faculty, what was your advice, or how would you handle it?
I would weigh in. I would tell my other administrators to weigh in on their individual basis. You know, I would urge white faculty to weigh in. You know, hiding it is no good. Shutting it down that's useless to me. That hides it, you know. It's like organizations, universities and other organizations are into this thing that if there's any little squeak of unhappiness or dissatisfaction or error, it's supposed to be repressed or hidden. I would suggest that organizations that do that are unhealthy, and they're probably implicitly authoritarian. You know, organizations that value critics, we ought to be valuing critics, you know. Universities that are willing to address and have difficult conversations, that's healthy to me, and it's necessary to anti-racism. So this always painting this happy face, that's a cover-up,
right?
You know, and that's complicitness, that's participation in racism. This is no joke. People's lives are on. Go watch that George Floyd video, watch the whole thing. That is what it's about. And it's just not him, it's everywhere. You know, it's kids in classrooms, you know, it's kids in jails. Like we pursue young black men for marijuana. White young men smoke it just as much as black men do, but we don't pursue them. We don't go where they're smoking. You know, it isn't used against them. It's everywhere. George Floyd is everywhere all of the time. And until we're willing to face that and get serious about it, we're participating.
Absolutely. I am with you on that. I can feel my Jane Elliott inner spirit coming out right now. I'm getting ready to fight, right? Okay, we have one more question for you before the end in conclusion of our awesome webinar. Thank you again so much for your time. But this is a question that I think a lot of people have difficulty answering when it comes up. What can be talked about with other white people who are really against the concept of reparation, claiming that, well, no, I didn't own slaves. Nobody I know enslaved. Why do I have to pay, right? Why do I have to use my tax dollars to make it right when I wasn't the slave owner? How would you answer?
But the reparations isn't just for slavery. It's for slavery. It's for Jim Crow. It's for mass incarceration. It's for the continuance of anti-black racism, which white people daily benefit from. The reparations is for this whole system that's benefited. You, if you're a white person in this country, you are directly benefiting from racism. You have more money, you have more social standing, you get the better jobs, you know, it's easier for you to get a bank loan. In all aspects of our lives, you're safer, you're more comfortable, you're more apt to have health care, you know. It's not true that it's just about slavery. It's about the whole history that continues today, from slavery to George Floyd. That whole history is with us now and benefiting us. And all this fragility stuff and giving into fear stuff, that's complicitness. That's you have to face. You're agreeing. I'm agreeing with the racism. It benefits me, so I'm just going to agree with it and go along.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and supporting the work of the Dream Collective. I know Dr. Williams and Dr. Hughes are both colleagues of yours. Do you have any final thoughts, pieces of wisdom, anything you can leave us with as we tackle these new challenges in anti-racism work?
I think I've said a lot.
You have. You have, and all worthwhile.
And
very helpful.
You know, this is urgent. This is an emergency. It's not, oh, we can take time. It isn't. George Floyd is happening every moment in some way or fashion. And if we don't want to be complicit in that, if we don't want to be supporting that, we have to speak up, stand up, and act up.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your wisdom with us. Critical whiteness is definitely a target focus for the Dream Collective, and we are going to be continuing to do more events, including webinars, and stay tuned for our podcast series on Black scholar activism in the Academy. That will be coming to you live. So make sure that you stay in touch with us on all our social media sites and on our website for future programming. Thanks everybody for coming and participating. Thank you, Dr. Scheurich. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.
Great work, Jim. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Sure.